I'm really happy that you've decided to invite me again to close the conference, which must mean that I didn't do too bad a job last year. I'll try again, as I did then, to bring this objective perspective to be both complementary, but also to bring up a few thoughts that might be useful to you in sharpening up and refining your work over the next couple of years. I think, first of all, I must start with compliments. Every session has been well organized, the content has been useful and relevant, and the interventions have all been vigorous. So I think it's been a very successful conference. And I think the strong message that comes out is that the MAP approach works, that by bringing together people with different interests into refining and developing policies for rural areas, you actually get much better results. So I think that has been a very strong characteristic on which pretty much everybody will agree. And this has all happened despite COVID. I must admit that I was a bit worried this time last year, thinking about the conditions we were then in, that the lack of personal interaction, the sort of opportunities for meeting and making new relationships that come about from face-to-face meetings, not only a meeting like this, but also the many meetings of the MAPs themselves, would actually diminish the rate of progress and the effectiveness. But it turns out not to have been, and I think that is by and large due to the immense adaptability and the usefulness of modern technology, for goodness sake, because if we were thinking back to 1988 and the future of rural society before the internet, nothing like this could have happened. We would have had to cope in different ways. So that aside, I mean, I think possibly things would have been even better had we not had the problems of COVID to deal with. But we shouldn't also neglect some of the advantages of COVID, the fact that we don't have to travel, we don't have to spend time making the arrangements, and participation can be much wider. So there are things on either side. Okay, so I think everybody would agree and believe that multi-actor platforms are a useful innovation. The concept has been proved. They are expanding. It seems that the approach is being adopted as part of the mainstream of rural policymaking at EU level. But also, I think, underneath the surface, there are differences of perspective. There are contrasting views, which mean that, you know, it's we've achieved this so far, but we now need to move forward and address some other more pressing issues. That came out, I think, most clearly in this morning's plenary session, which I found really interesting, watching people wriggling and negotiating in the interaction between the different viewpoints being expressed. I want to pick out a couple of points from that discussion, which I think from my external and supposedly objective perspective would be really important for the rest of the Sherpa project and also its sustainability beyond 2023. So the first is this. I think the quality and accuracy of data have always been an issue. There have been never-ending discussions about what is rural, and perhaps more importantly, from the practical policy purpose, where is rural? Where does rural stop and where does urban start? Or is there some peri-urban space in between where different strengths of influences can be felt? But I think it's been quite clear that if you try to base policymaking on numerical measurement and analysis alone, you're definitely not going to get it right. And in that sense, I come back to my opening point that, you know, the maps are a useful way of bridging that gap, of allowing people from different perspectives to exchange information, to learn from each other, to collaborate on the basis of mutual understanding and actually achieve progress in improving policy. So from that point of view, the way in which rural policy seems to be adapting, if we can believe what the Commission are saying in their interventions in the conference, seems to be that by using this approach, it is possible to adapt policies more closely to the huge diversity of rural area that exists, whilst at the same time having a sort of a framework for addressing the very real and common problems that they face. But whilst the map process is obviously good at doing that, it has an obvious drawback. There are only 40 of them. And the 40 that you have could not possibly cover, especially because their membership has to be limited, because in order to be effective, there can only be small group discussions. It cannot possibly cover the very wide range of diversity of conditions, of geographies, economic conditions, and so on. So there's going to be inevitably gaps, and if the movement of opinion from the discussions in the maps up to rural policy is only based on a fraction of experience, then it's not necessarily going to result in policy which is adaptable to all experiences. So, and I think it's an inherent problem. Even if you had 400 maps rather than 40, you would still not be able to cover every circumstance. And just imagine the analytical and distillation difficulties that you as researchers would have in order to sort of make comprehensive the work of 400 maps. I don't envy you that task. The main point, though, I think, which is probably really important, is that there might be a process of adverse selection occurring here, in the sense that where you have people who are already reasonably well endowed or relatively well endowed with resources, who are articulate and able to make their voices heard, then they are the sort of people that are going to produce circumstances where maps might be established and to provide the personnel for them. Whereas, of course, the really important issue, and it's one that stems from the work that I've been doing recently on the analysis of poverty and deprivation, is that it's very difficult to seek the views and hear the voices of the people who really need to be helped. So I think that's one issue which might provide you with considerable focus for attention in the remaining period of Sherpa, is how to give voice to those who don't have one and who cannot articulate one. The second point that I'd like to make is that the process of deliberative democracy, the sharing of perspectives, the learning from each other and so on, does actually result, as we have seen, in a certain amount of quick win in terms of policy refinement. It's the process works, and it's useful, and it's important. But already I think the limits of what can be achieved through maps are becoming clear through a rising sense of frustration. I think this most particularly came out, in Johannes' intervention in this morning's plenary session, which said we need action now. We can't wait around till 2028. And of course, the glacially slow process of policy making within the EU institutional frameworks is, if anything, getting worse, I think, because of the issues with co-determination with the Parliament and the Council and all these kinds of things, really beginning to feel an impact from these now. It is actually important to recognise that whilst it is possible to make progress in some areas and make progress quickly, it's also a very long-term process of reform that needs to be undertaken. And it's not just about the power relations between, say, the Commission, the member states, the various regional and local levels of government, and civil society. It's important also to recognize, as Mario did in his intervention this morning, that there are powerful lobbies, and that rural as a constituency does not have such a power base. I would actually go a little bit further and say that I think that an awful lot of the issues and concerns that affect rural people, and also people in situations of urban disadvantage, who, despite differences, share a lot in common with the issues of rurality, that is shaped and more than influenced, but actually pretty much determined by the power of corporate capital and finance. These are, these are structures that are so deeply embedded in the operation of society and economy that we cannot ignore them. Okay, so I'm not going to relapse into some sort of Marxist rant at this stage, but it's necessary to recognize that there are deeper structures that are not necessarily favorable to the rural interest. And it's also important not to get too gloomy about this. There are examples, and I'm sure there will continue to be examples, of real progressive change that have come about despite these structures in society. And in fact, we wouldn't be progressing at all, socially or economically, if that didn't happen. So the key message, I think, that I'd like to end up with is that there is a strong multiplier effect, a catalytic effect that comes about from processes like the establishment of the multi-actor platforms. And we must hope, by nurturing them and by giving them as strong a level of support as is possible, that they too will become the focus of these kinds of positive change in society, to the benefit not only just for rural people, but for people as a whole.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this closing remark. And I think we will invite you next year again for the third conference.